Okay, we're in Daniel chapter 5. Daniel chapter 5. Let me, before we get into the reading tonight, let's take a look at this timeline. I know you're going to have trouble seeing that from where you are, but I couldn't make it any bigger, despite my best efforts. There's a lot on this chart. But remember where we've been in the previous chapters, 1 through 4. We've been talking about King Nebuchadnezzar, who was the king of the Babylonians. Remember, Nebuchadnezzar was the head of gold in the statue that we see in chapter 2, and that's about to change. We'll see in chapter 5 that the new kingdom is coming in just as was prophesied. But I wanted to give you a little bit of an overview of Nebuchadnezzar's dysfunctional family. After Nebuchadnezzar died, it was very tumultuous in the Babylonian Empire. Nebuchadnezzar had a son named Evil-Merodach. Evil-Merodach. So if you're looking for baby names that are biblical, Evil-Merodach. I don't recommend it. I don't think the evil part of his name is in the way that we think of evil. Actually, he was pretty decent to the Jewish people. He didn't last very long, a couple of years, and he was murdered. And the one that took his place is Neriglissar, if I'm pronouncing that right. He becomes king, and I think he died of natural causes, but he only lasted a very short while. And then, actually, Neriglissar was the brother-in-law of Evil-Merodach. Boy, this is rough tonight. The brother-in-law murdered him. And then we have Labashi-Marduk come along, and he, again, just for a few months, maybe a year, is over the Babylonian Empire. And then Nabonidus becomes king. So Nabonidus is the father of Belshazzar, and we're going to read a lot about Belshazzar tonight in chapter 5. And so we're at the very end of the Babylonian Empire here in chapter 5. And we'll talk a little bit more about this history as we go along. But let's begin reading in verse 1. Daniel chapter 5, verse 1. Belshazzar the king held a great feast for 1,000 of his nobles, and he was drinking wine in the presence of the house of the 1,000. When Belshazzar tasted the wine, he gave orders to bring the gold and silver vessels which Nebuchadnezzar his father had taken out of the temple, which was in Jerusalem, so that the king and his nobles, his wives, and his concubines might drink from them. Then they brought the gold vessels that had been taken out of the temple, the house of God, which was in Jerusalem, and the king and his nobles, his wives, and his concubines drank from them. They drank the wine and praised the gods of gold and silver, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone. You get the sense that this was probably a pretty wild party that Belshazzar was having. He's got 1,000 of his nobles there. They're drinking wine. And it says in verse 2, when Belshazzar drank of the wine, he calls for what to happen? He says, go get the vessels out of the temple. Remember, Nebuchadnezzar had taken these things out of the temple of God, these vessels, and brought them into his palace or wherever he placed them. And so he says, go get the gold and silver vessels. And what do they do with them? Filling them with wine, drinking out of them, and bowing down to worship all of these false gods. Well, let's jump right into some application perhaps here. What do we learn from this? What can you see here? I think we have here an example of what not to do as far as drinking parties, as drunkenness. The Bible specifically condemns drunkenness, doesn't it? Intoxication. And the Bible specifically condemns drinking parties. And this is exactly what you have here. It's a drinking party. And what happens when you get involved in these things? What can easily happen when you're drinking and partying? They're disrespectful to God, losing their common sense. That's right. And you see it over and over and over again in life. Alcohol is a dangerous thing. And a lot of times we debate, like, can I have one sip of alcohol or 2 sips, or how much is too much? And I think we're asking the wrong questions there. I think the questions we need to ask are, does it bring glory to God and to Christ? We need to ask, not, how much can I have and still, edge up to that line where I might become intoxicated. But instead we need to ask, here's a great question, how will this affect my brethren? How will it affect possibly my brethren or my family who may struggle with alcohol? And we should ask ourselves, what good comes from it? That's related to the first question. Will this glorify God? Will this glorify Christ? What good will come of this? These are the questions we need to ask. And I'm not here to try to legislate and speak and make rules where the Bible has not. But we know for certain that drunkenness is wrong. It's a sin in the eyes of God. We know that drinking parties, carousing, things like that, it's a sin in the eyes of God. And so we need to ask ourselves, how far away do we want to stay away from those things? That's the question. Because you see here, as you see in our time, in our day and age, as you see in families, alcohol has often ruinous, terrible consequences. It contributes to a lot of evil. Right. That's the debate we have, right? How many drinks can I have? What is inebriation? When does it occur? And for me, I just stay away from it completely, so I don't have to ask those questions. The Bible does say, there's the proverb about don't look at the wine as it sparkles in the cup. Don't even look at it, because it has a power over people. So just a caution that we need to be very, very careful that we're not involved in these things as Christians. The drunkenness and the drinking parties. So, how did God, well, let me back up a second. Let's talk a little bit about Belshazzar. Notice in verse 2, where does it say it? It says in here somewhere that Nebuchadnezzar was the father of Belshazzar. It's in 2. That's what I thought. I was on the right track. It's in 2. Well, historians look at that and have in the past and said, well, there you go. Daniel can't be accurate because Belshazzar, first of all, we don't think he even existed. There's no historical record of Belshazzar. So Daniel must be historical fiction. There's no record of anybody called Belshazzar. And secondly, even if there was, he's not the son of Nebuchadnezzar. We know the son of Nebuchadnezzar was evil Merodach. And so I want to caution us too to just be careful about listening to such things from the so-called scholars. There are liberal scholars that don't really believe in the Bible. They don't really believe that it's the Word of God. And this was the argument for many years up until modern times. There's nobody named Belshazzar. Well, guess what's been dug up, though? This was a long time ago, 1854. This is the Nabonidus cylinder. Nabonidus was the father of Belshazzar. And what this says on here, I'm sure you can read it for yourself. What this says is there was someone named Belshazzar, and he was the son of Nabonidus. Okay, so the so-called liberal scholars then say, well, okay, fine, but he's not Nebuchadnezzar's son, and he was never the king, so Daniel can't be right. And then they dug something else up. In 1882, this was published. I don't know when they dug it up. But this identifies, this is the Nabonidus Chronicle, so it's called. It's in the British History Museum, I believe. It identifies not only that Belshazzar existed, but that he's called the Crown Prince in this document here. Well, Crown Prince, that's not really king. I mean, Daniel's saying in chapter 5, Belshazzar was king. Just hold on, we're going to dig something else up. This is the Persian verse account of Nabonidus, published in 1924, which says that Nabonidus went on a long journey and entrusted the kingship to his son, Belshazzar. Nabonidus was off in Arabia fighting some sort of war, and he leaves Belshazzar and entrusted him the kingship. So, again and again and again, the Bible has been proven correct, even though people are saying it can't be that way, it never happened that way, and yet the archaeological and historical record often clears a lot of this up. But remember what we talked about last week, too, that we shouldn't take this as that we have to have archaeological evidence for everything we believe. We have, in the article I quoted from Russ that he wrote some years ago, we have maybe 0.006% of all the possible archaeological evidence out there. And so it's unreasonable to think that everything that we believe has to be backed up by archaeology. But I'm just saying, we need to be careful that we don't listen to people that are trying to make us to doubt the Scriptures and to discount the Scriptures. Yeah. Yeah. Some of that is in the Bible. Some of it comes from these sort of writings that they have discovered. For example, Evil Merodach is, I know you can't read it back there, 2 Kings 25, 27 through 30, he's mentioned. He releases Jehoiachin from prison. He was the king of Judah. He was in prison for 30-something years, and Evil Merodach releases him. He's also in Jeremiah 52. These other guys, I don't believe you'll see them in the Scriptures that I'm aware of, but you see their names in history from the things they've discovered. Yeah. 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 And remember, though, that these guys, this took up a period from about 5 years for all these guys in there, because they kept getting murdered, and, you know, it was very tumultuous. Right. Right. Yes, thanks for pointing that out. when he says the son of Nebuchadnezzar, there's no word in the Hebrew or Aramaic, as I understand it, that there's no word for like grandfather or great-grandfather. It's just son. So it's talking about a descendant of Nebuchadnezzar. And it doesn't even have to be in the bloodline. So I read, it's that it could just be a predecessor, not even necessarily in the bloodline of Nebuchadnezzar. So we shouldn't be upset either by the fact that it says the son of Nebuchadnezzar when it was really the grandson or whatever he was. Other questions or comments? Just a little history for us, kind of put all this together.
I have a film on archaeology in the Bible. It's very interesting. I showed it here when I was teaching adults years ago, and very interesting.
Yeah. It's very interesting, isn't it? The archaeology in the Bible. And like I said, we don't need archaeological evidence for everything, but when you find it, and people have been doubting it for so many years, and it's like, well, this was true all along. That's happened many, many times with the Scriptures. And so we need to stop doubting the Scriptures. They're accurate, they're true, they're given by God, they're historically correct, and we can trust them. Let's read on, verse 5. So after they're drinking the wine and they're praising the gods of gold and silver and bronze, etc., in verse 4. Verse 5 says, "Suddenly the fingers of a man's hand emerged and began writing opposite the lampstand on the plaster of the wall of the king's palace. And the king saw the back of the hand that did the writing. Then the king's face grew pale, and his thoughts alarmed him, and his hip joints went slack, and his knees began knocking together. The king called aloud to bring the conjurers, the Chaldeans, the diviners. The king spoke and said to the wise men of Babylon, 'Any man who can read this inscription and explain its interpretation to me shall be clothed in purple and have a necklace of gold around his neck and have authority as third ruler in the kingdom.'" Such a powerful man, the king of the known world. And yet when he's confronted by God, this hand writing on the wall, it says his hips came out of joint and his knees started knocking and he grew pale. And it's like we've seen earlier in Daniel. He starts searching out for the wise men. Somebody tell me what this writing on the wall means. What does all this mean? And notice that he says at the end of verse 7, if anybody can figure this out, essentially, he's saying, you will have authority as third ruler in the kingdom. Well, why would he say third ruler in the kingdom? Yeah, that's right. There were two kings. Nabonidus was off fighting in Arabia. He left the kingship to his son, Belshazzar. And so there was a co-regency. They were both kings. And so Daniel, or he says, whoever can figure this out, you'll be number 3. And so it just lines up really well with history once again. Verse 8, "Then all the king's wise men came in, but they could not read the inscription or make known its interpretation to the king. Then King Belshazzar was greatly alarmed. His face grew paler, and his nobles were perplexed. The queen entered the banquet hall because of the words of the king and his nobles. The queen spoke and said, 'O king, live forever. Do not let your thoughts alarm you or your face be pale. There is a man in your kingdom in whom is a spirit of the holy gods. And in the days of your father, illumination, insight, and wisdom, like the wisdom of the gods, were found in him. And King Nebuchadnezzar, your father the king, appointed him chief of the magicians, conjurers, Chaldeans, and diviners. This was because of an extraordinary spirit, knowledge, and insight, interpretation of dreams, explanations of enigmas, and solving of difficult problems were found in this Daniel, whom the king named Belteshazzar. Let Daniel now be summoned and he will declare the interpretation. So the queen steps in. This might have been the queen mother, some speculate. In other words, maybe the grandmother of Belshazzar, something like that. But she says, I remember your father, Nebuchadnezzar. He knew a man with the spirit of the gods in him. There's that interesting mixed up language, spirit of the gods, plural. But you see the mindset and where these people are coming from in their pagan mindset. Let's read on, verse 13. Then Daniel was brought in before the king. The king spoke and said to Daniel, Are you that Daniel who is one of the exiles from Judah, whom my father the king brought from Judah? Now I have heard about you that a spirit of the gods is in you, and that illumination, insight, and extraordinary wisdom have been found in you. Just now the wise men and the conjurers were brought in before me that they might read the inscription and make its interpretation known to me. But they could not declare the interpretation of the message. But I personally have heard about you, that you are able to give interpretations and solve difficult problems. Now, if you are able to read the inscription and make its interpretation known to me, you will be clothed with purple and wear a necklace of gold around your neck, and you will have authority as the third ruler in the kingdom. Then Daniel answered and said to the king, Keep your gifts for yourself, or give your rewards to someone else. However, I will read the inscription to the king and make the interpretation known to him. Why do you think that Daniel would not accept the gifts from the king? I mean, that's a pretty big gift to be number 3 in the whole kingdom. I don't know that I know the answer to this, but what do you think? What could possibly be going through his head? Mike?
I think he was very, very rebellious and resisted God.
So he didn't want any part of the idol worship. Yeah, I think that's very likely. Russell? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I think he was so evil, and what he was doing with these holy items, just, I don't want any part of this. Just, I'll read it for you, but Bob. Yeah, he had to be well aware of this, that there's no power in these idols. Yeah, he's been there and done that. And Daniel here is probably in his 70s. He's not a young man anymore. He's been through this. Some people question where was Daniel? Why was he not, immediately there in Belshazzar's court? Could have been with all the turmoil and the murdering and everything going on. He was just sort of forgotten and pushed aside, and maybe he liked it that way. Do you have a thought, Russ?
Yeah, I think he's maybe more retired.
Yeah.
And the second thing was the offer was basically going to expire that time.
That's true. That's true. And well, did he know this at that point? If he had seen the language yet, he would have known. That's right. Beth. Yeah. That's a good point. Yeah. Yeah, only beholden to God. Doesn't want the strings that might come with this. And I get the idea that Belshazzar may have been more wicked even than Nebuchadnezzar. And it seemed like Daniel and Nebuchadnezzar got on pretty well, even though he tried to burn up his friends. That's pretty tough there, but it seemed like they had a respect for one another, at least. Belshazzar, I don't know, he might have been a whole different kind of character than Nebuchadnezzar. Other questions or thoughts? Look at verse 18. O King, the Most High God granted sovereignty, grandeur, glory, and majesty to Nebuchadnezzar, your father. This is Daniel speaking. Because of the grandeur which he bestowed on him, all the peoples, nations, and men of every language feared him and trembled before him. Whomever he wished, he killed. And whomever he wished, he spared alive. And whomever he wished, he elevated. And whomever he wished, he humbled. You think that would go to your head very easily if you had that kind of power over people? Whoever I say dies, they die. Whoever I want to keep alive, they're alive. I mean, he does whatever he wants. And so you see, at least he thinks he does, you see the pride and the arrogance that crept into Nebuchadnezzar. And we saw what happened to him last week in chapter 4. And so Daniel is reviewing this with Belshazzar, verse 21, or 20 rather. But when his heart was lifted up and his spirit became so proud that he behaved arrogantly, he was deposed from his royal throne and his glory was taken from him. He was also driven away from mankind, and his heart was made like that of beasts, and his dwelling place was with the wild donkeys. He was given grass to eat like cattle, and his body was drenched with the dew of heaven, until he recognized that the Most High God is ruler over the realm of mankind, and that he sets over it whomever he wishes. That was the major lesson we learned last week that Nebuchadnezzar had to learn. God is in control. God makes kings who they are. God chooses who they are. He sets it over whomever he wishes. Is that still true today? Yes. God is still in control. And everything that goes on in governments and in the world and all around us, God is still in control of it all. That should give us a lot of peace. Now look at verse 22. Yet you, his son, Belshazzar, have not humbled your heart, even though you knew all this. Oh, that's an indictment right there. Belshazzar, you knew all of this. Had he seen all of this happen? Had he seen his grandfather lose his mind and eat grass? And maybe he had. He had definitely heard about it. And he knew what it was all about. And yet Daniel says to him, you have not humbled yourself before God. Right? You, 22, have not humbled your heart, even though you knew all of this. Well, do we sometimes do things in life even though we know better, should know better? Do we sometimes fail to do things in life even though we know better? Even though sometimes that we've witnessed in our own lives and in our own families the devastation that sin can cause, sin of various kinds. And we see that, and yet we do it anyway, sometimes. Why do we do that? Sometimes we see it in our family. We see sin. We see things that shouldn't have been done, and yet we end up doing it ourselves. Without the help of God, that's how we end up. I think that certainly could work in here. Selfishness. Yeah. Lack of humility, as we see in Belshazzar. So you knew all this, and yet you've not humbled your heart. Look at verse 23. But you have exalted yourself against the Lord of heaven, and they have brought the vessels of his house before you. And you and your nobles, your wives and your concubines have been drinking wine from them. And you have praised the gods of silver and gold, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone, which do not see, hear, or understand, but the God in whose hand are your life breath, and all your ways you have not glorified. He didn't glorify God. He took the holy things of God from the temple of God, and he blasphemed God, and he didn't respect God or reverence God. And you know, it got me to thinking, do we sometimes know the good that God has done in our lives, and yet we don't thank him or glorify him like we should? Do we fail to realize that our life breath and all of our ways are in his hands, even right now as we speak? In him we live and move and have our very being. Do we fail to acknowledge him in all of our ways? You know, we need to make sure that we're humbling ourselves before God and acknowledging God for all the good in our lives. And I think about Belshazzar and his guests at the party, taking the holy things of God and treating them as common. And it made me think about how much more should we be afraid? How much more should we reverence God? Because we, as the people of God, do you know who we are? You know who you are? Here in Daniel, we're talking about vessels in the temple of God, but do you know who you are? Who we are collectively? We are the temple of God. We're not just talking about vessels in the temple of God. We are the temple of God. Each one of you has the Spirit of God dwelling in you, and God dwells in us as his house. And so how much more should we be afraid when we do things that could destroy the temple of God? When we destroy one another, when we tear one another down, when we fail to encourage one another. You know, Paul says in 1 Corinthians 3, he says, if anyone destroys the temple of God, that's us. If anyone destroys the temple of God, God will destroy him, for the temple of God is holy, and that is what you are. So it just hit me, you know, Belshazzar, he got into a lot of trouble with God for treating the holy things of God as common, and yet sometimes we can do the same by the way we treat one another. I'm not saying you all are. I'm just saying it's something we need to be aware of and careful about, how we treat one another as the temple of the living God. Anything you want to add here? All right, let's keep going. Look at verse 24. Then the hand was sent from him, and this inscription was written out. Now this is the inscription that was written out. Mene, mene, tekel, upharsin. This is the interpretation of the message. Mina, God has numbered your kingdom and put an end to it. What does tekel mean in verse 27? Weighed and found wanting. So numbered, weighed, and found wanting. And what about, you may have farson or upharsin, but in 28 he says Perez. That's the singular form of farson. What does it mean? Divided. kingdom has been divided and given over to the Medes and Persians. Numbered, weighed, and divided. And Farson, or Perez, has the same letters in Aramaic as the word Persian, so it's kind of a play on words, as I understand it. I'm out of my depth as far as translating Aramaic, but this is what I read, that it has the letters of Persia in there. There's this play on words, as well as this message of you've been numbered and weighed and your kingdom is divided, will be divided. And this happens very quickly. Look at verse 29. Then Belshazzar gave orders, and they clothed Daniel with purple and put a necklace of gold around his neck and issued a proclamation concerning him that he now had authority as the third ruler in the kingdom. But as Russ pointed out, didn't last long, did it? Look at the next verse. That same night, Belshazzar, the Chaldean king, was slain. So Darius the Mede received the kingdom at about the age of 62. That same night.
Which means, when all this is going on, this party, they are being deceived.
Yes. That's exactly right.
And the way it means the Persians got into Babylon was by diverting the river, because the river flowed under the wall down there.
Yes.
So it's not like this just suddenly happened. They were deceived for a while.
Right.
The river was in it.
This was planned out. That's exactly right. If you read the history of this, the Euphrates River went around the city of Babylon, and people thought it was just impregnable. You can't get in there. And they had 20 years worth of provisions stored up. And so Belshazzar and his leaders, they're partying, they're drinking, they don't have anything to worry about. And the Persians had created canals, and they had diverted the Euphrates River, and at least made it shallow enough where they could wade across it. So while the party's going on, they're crossing the river. They're either digging under the wall or going through the aqueducts or something like that to get into the city, and it's just over. Belshazzar is slain, and so the head of gold that we saw in chapter 2 on the statue. Right.
And it takes someone who has God's ear to tell you that's what it means.
Right. And Daniel had that wisdom and insight from God. And what he said, it came to pass. The head of gold has fallen. We're now to the chest and arms, remember, of silver, which was what kingdom? The Medes and the Persians. And Darius the Mede takes over the kingdom, and we pick up with him in chapter 6 next week. And by the way, when we get to chapter 6, Daniel is probably 80 or more. He's getting to be an older man, not the teenager that we saw earlier in the book. And as he's depicted in the lion's den often as a young man, he was getting some age on him by this time. So we'll stop there. Thank you all for your thoughts and comments, and we'll see you Sunday.